Hello, my dear friends.
Imagine living your entire life without a shower, without toilet paper, and with streets that rarely stayed clean for long. In the Middle Ages, daily hygiene looked nothing like the world we know today. Yet people still found surprising ways to stay clean and survive in crowded towns and castles. From shared toilets built into castle walls, to herbs carried to mask the smell of entire cities, the routines of medieval life reveal a world both shocking and strangely practical. Tonight, we step into that world to discover what everyday hygiene really looked like in the Middle Ages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background. And let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone from the modern world were to wake inside a small medieval village, the absence of a bath would be one of the first things they noticed. There would be no tiled bathroom, no steaming shower, and no faucet turning easily beneath the hand. Instead, the morning would begin in a wooden house that smelled faintly of smoke, damp straw, and the lingering presence of yesterday's work. People rose from their beds, dressed themselves in the same linen undergarments and wool clothing worn the day before, and stepped into another day without any expectation of washing their bodies completely. To modern minds, this sounds unpleasant or even shocking, but to people in the Middle Ages, it was simply how life worked. The main reason was practical rather than careless. Heating enough water for a bath required time, fuel, and effort that most households could not spare. Firewood had to be collected or purchased, and large quantities of water had to be carried from wells, streams, or communal pumps. Every bucket meant another trip across muddy yards or narrow village paths. When people already spent long days working in fields, workshops, or kitchens, the thought of heating several tubs of water just to wash the body rarely seemed worth the effort. Energy was reserved for cooking meals and warming the home, not for bathing. Even when water was available, preparing a bath remained a demanding process. Large metal or wooden tubs had to be filled slowly, often with water heated in kettles over open flames. It might take hours to gather enough warm water to fill the tub halfway. Families sometimes shared the same bath water to avoid wasting fuel, which meant the idea of a private bath was rare outside wealthy households. In smaller homes, the tub might even be placed near the hearth in the main room, turning bathing into a practical activity rather than a private ritual. Because of these difficulties, full baths were not a daily routine. In many places, they occurred only on special occasions. Religious holidays, weddings, or seasonal festivals sometimes provided the excuse for a thorough washing. During these moments, people might take the time to heat water, scrub their bodies carefully, and put on freshly cleaned linen garments. The process could feel almost ceremonial, marking an event that stood apart from ordinary life. For most of the year, however, people relied on simpler methods to stay reasonably clean. One of the most common practices was washing small parts of the body rather than the entire person. A bowl of water and a cloth could be used to wipe the face, neck, hands, and sometimes the feet. This approach required far less water and fuel, and it could be done quickly before leaving for work. Farmers, labourers, and craftsmen often used damp cloths to remove sweat or dirt at the end of the day. The goal was not complete cleanliness, but simple comfort and social respectability. Linen undergarments also played an important role in everyday hygiene. Many medieval people wore a layer of linen clothing beneath their outer garments, made from wool or heavier fabrics. Linen absorbed sweat and oils from the skin, acting almost like a filter between the body and the outer clothing. Because linen was lighter and easier to wash than wool, people could clean these undergarments more often than the clothing worn on top. By changing or washing linen pieces periodically, individuals managed to maintain a sense of freshness, even without frequent baths. This system worked surprisingly well for the conditions of the time. When historians examine surviving texts and records, they often find that medieval people did care about cleanliness. They simply approached it differently from modern societies. Washing the hands, face, and linen garments regularly was considered sensible and respectable. Full water immersion was not always necessary to achieve what they considered an acceptable level of hygiene. From a modern perspective, the difference is striking. Today, bathing is effortless. A person turns a handle, and clean water flows instantly. Heating systems provide warmth without effort, and soap products promise fragrances that last all day. The medieval world offered none of these conveniences. Clean water required labour, heat required fuel, and both were limited resources. In that environment, people adapted their expectations. Cleanliness became a matter of managing what was available, rather than pursuing perfection. Social customs also reflected these realities. Visitors did not expect hosts to provide bathing facilities, and neighbours rarely judged one another based on daily washing habits. Instead, appearance and clothing signalled whether someone cared for themselves properly. A person wearing reasonably clean linen and tidy hair was often considered respectable enough. The standards were practical and shaped by the environment people lived in. For peasants and labourers, the rhythm of life left little space for elaborate hygiene routines. Work began early in the morning and continued until daylight faded. Hands became rough from tools, soil, and animals. Bodies collected dust from roads and fields. Yet these conditions were shared by nearly everyone in the community, which meant they felt ordinary rather than alarming. Cleanliness was measured relative to what others experienced, not against an ideal that no one could realistically achieve. Even within towns and villages, attitudes toward bathing varied depending on wealth and status. Wealthier households sometimes possessed larger tubs, or servants who could help prepare bath water. In castles or noble homes, portable baths occasionally appeared in private chambers. These luxuries allowed the elite to wash more comfortably than ordinary villagers. Still, even among the wealthy, daily bathing was far from universal. The labour required to prepare hot water remained significant regardless of status. Thinking about this world can feel unsettling today. It is easy to imagine the discomfort of wearing dusty clothes or going weeks without a full bath. Yet the people who lived through those centuries rarely described their lives in those terms. They focused instead on work, family, faith, and survival. Bathing was simply one small part of a much larger routine, shaped by the limits of their technology and resources. The medieval approach to cleanliness reminds us that standards of hygiene are not fixed in time. They change alongside technology, economics, and cultural expectations. What feels unacceptable today may once have been perfectly normal. For the men and women of the Middle Ages, wiping the body with a damp cloth and changing linen garments was often enough to feel presentable in daily life. Life without regular bathing might seem surprising, yet it was a practical response to the limits of medieval technology and resources. But personal hygiene in the Middle Ages did not end with how people washed their bodies. Because the places where people relieved themselves were often far more shocking than the absence of baths, public bathing had once been far more common in medieval Europe than many people imagine today. In earlier centuries, particularly during the early Middle Ages, towns and cities across the continent maintained communal bathhouses that served an important social and practical function. These establishments were loosely inspired by the bathing traditions of the ancient Roman world, where bathing had been a central feature of urban life. Though the medieval versions were simpler and smaller, the idea remained similar. People gathered in shared spaces where heated water was available, tubs or pools could be used, and the body could be washed more thoroughly than was possible inside most private homes. In many towns, these bathhouses stood near rivers or public wells where water could be drawn easily. Inside, large wooden tubs or stone basins were filled with water heated over fires in nearby furnaces. Visitors would pay a small fee, enter the bathing room, and spend time washing themselves with the help of attendants or family members. For travellers arriving from long journeys on dusty roads, the bathhouse offered relief that was difficult to find anywhere else. Merchants, craftsmen, and labourers might stop by after long days of work, eager to rinse away sweat and grime that had collected beneath layers of wool clothing. The bathhouses were not only about hygiene, they also became social spaces where conversations flowed easily and people gathered in a relaxed environment. Friends might visit together, neighbours might exchange news, and travellers might learn about events happening in the town. In some places, food and drink were even served nearby, turning the bathhouse into something resembling a small gathering place. The warm rooms filled with steam and the sound of splashing water created an atmosphere that felt welcoming compared to the cold streets outside. For a time, these establishments were accepted as a normal part of urban life. Town records from various parts of Europe mention bathhouses operating openly and legally. Owners paid taxes or licensing fees, and many communities depended on them as convenient places where people could wash properly. Because most homes lacked large tubs and sufficient heating, the bathhouse provided a service that individuals simply could not reproduce on their own. However, this acceptance did not last forever. Gradually, attitudes toward communal bathing began to change. One reason was the spread of disease during the later medieval centuries. Epidemics moved through crowded cities, leaving populations frightened and uncertain about what caused illness. Without scientific knowledge about bacteria or viruses, people tried to understand disease through observation and rumor. Some began to suspect that places where many bodies gathered together, especially warm and humid environments like bathhouses, might contribute to the spread of sickness. The fear intensified during periods of devastating epidemics that swept through Europe. Communities searched desperately for explanations. Since bathhouses brought strangers into close contact, they became easy targets for suspicion. Authorities in certain towns began to question whether these establishments were safe for public health. Though there was little real evidence connecting them directly to outbreaks, the atmosphere of fear made many people cautious about entering them. At the same time, moral concerns started to influence opinions about bathhouses. Communal bathing involved people sharing spaces with minimal clothing, something that religious authorities in some regions began to view with discomfort. Critics argued that the environment of warm rooms, relaxed conversation, and mixed company might encourage behavior that was considered improper. Sermons and public warnings sometimes described bathhouses as places where discipline weakened and temptation could arise. These concerns slowly shifted the reputation of communal bathing. What had once been viewed as practical and harmless began to carry hints of danger or moral suspicion. Some bathhouses continued operating, but their numbers gradually declined. Town councils occasionally issued regulations limiting their activities or closing certain establishments altogether. In places where epidemics had struck particularly hard, the fear of disease alone was enough to convince communities to abandon them. As the bathhouses disappeared, people lost one of the few places where regular, full bathing had been possible. Without these facilities, the task of washing the entire body became even more complicated. Private homes rarely had the space or resources to prepare large baths frequently. Water still had to be carried by hand, and heating it required valuable fuel. The convenience once provided by the public bathhouse could not easily be replaced. The change affected everyday life in subtle ways. When bathhouses were available, people could occasionally enjoy a proper wash without enormous effort. After their disappearance, such opportunities became rarer. Many individuals returned entirely to simpler methods of hygiene, relying on cloth washing, changing linen garments, and occasional baths prepared only during special occasions. Looking back from the modern world, the disappearance of these bathhouses seems almost ironic. Today, public facilities such as swimming pools, gyms, and spas are carefully regulated and considered beneficial for health and relaxation. Clean water systems and sanitation technologies make shared spaces far safer than they were centuries ago. In the medieval world, however, fear and uncertainty shaped decisions in ways that sometimes reduced access to cleanliness, rather than improving it. The closing of bathhouses did not happen everywhere at the same moment, nor was it always permanent. Some regions continued to maintain bathing traditions longer than others. Yet across much of Europe, the general pattern was similar. Facilities that had once supported regular bathing slowly vanished from urban landscapes, leaving people with fewer options for keeping themselves fully clean. In quiet ways, this shift reshaped daily habits. Washing became something done in smaller steps rather than in complete immersion. Cloths, basins, and linen garments took the place of large communal baths. Medieval people adapted, as they always had, adjusting their routines to match the resources and beliefs surrounding them. The disappearance of public bathhouses quietly transformed how medieval people maintained cleanliness. Yet losing these spaces did not remove the need for hygiene. It only forced people to find other solutions within their homes. Because the simple piece of clothing worn closest to the skin would become one of the most important tools for staying clean in a world where full baths had grown rare. Clothing worn closest to the skin quietly became one of the most important tools for personal hygiene in the medieval world. In a time when frequent bathing was difficult and public bathhouses were disappearing from many towns, people needed another way to manage sweat, dirt, and body odour. The solution was surprisingly simple. Beneath heavy wool garments, most medieval men and women wore a layer of linen clothing that acted almost like a barrier between the body and the outer layers of their attire. This linen undergarment was not meant to be seen by others. It remained hidden beneath tunics, dresses, and cloaks made from thicker fabrics. Yet despite its invisible role, it served a practical purpose that was widely understood. Linen had a unique quality compared with wool or leather. It absorbed moisture from the skin far more effectively and could be washed more easily without losing its shape. Because of this, the linen layer quietly collected sweat and oils from the body throughout the day. For people who spent long hours working in fields, workshops, kitchens, or crowded streets, this layer became essential. Wool garments were expensive and difficult to clean. Washing them too often could damage the fabric and weaken the threads. As a result, the outer clothing of medieval people might be worn for long periods with only occasional cleaning. The linen layer underneath solved this problem by taking the burden of daily contact with the body. At the end of a long day, when dust from roads and fields had settled into clothing, the linen undergarment carried much of that grime. It could then be removed and replaced with a cleaner one if the household owned more than a single piece. Even when replacements were limited, the linen garment could be washed far more easily than wool. Water, simple soap made from ash or animal fat, and a hard scrubbing against wooden boards were often enough to clean it. This routine created a subtle system of hygiene that worked surprisingly well for its time. Instead of bathing the entire body frequently, medieval people focused on cleaning the fabric that touched their skin. By removing the linen layer and washing it regularly, they prevented much of the sweat and odour from reaching the expensive outer garments. In this way, the linen acted almost like a filter that protected the clothing worn in public. It also helped maintain a sense of freshness that might otherwise have been difficult to achieve. Changing a linen garment could immediately make a person feel cleaner, even without a full bath. The dry fabric against the skin replaced the dampness of the previous day, offering comfort after hours of work. For individuals who lived in environments where dust, smoke, and animal smells were constant companions, this simple change of clothing made a noticeable difference. Modern readers might be surprised by how carefully medieval societies valued linen for this purpose. Records from households, monasteries, and noble estates often mention the importance of maintaining sufficient linen supplies. Wealthier families sometimes owned several sets, allowing them to rotate garments more frequently. Servants or household members would wash and dry them regularly, ensuring that clean pieces were available when needed. For poorer families, the situation was more limited. They might own only 1 or 2 linen garments per person. Even so, the same principle applied. Washing the linen whenever possible helped preserve both comfort and cleanliness. A fresh linen shirt or chemise could transform the feeling of wearing the same outer clothing day after day. The effort required to maintain these garments showed how seriously people took the challenge of personal hygiene. The process of washing linen was not easy work. Water had to be carried from wells or rivers, heated over fires, and poured into wooden tubs. Soap was often rough and homemade, created from mixtures of animal fat and alkaline ash. Garments were soaked, scrubbed, and sometimes beaten against stones or boards to remove dirt. Afterward, they were hung in open air to dry, often catching sunlight and wind that helped remove lingering odours. Despite the labour involved, many households considered this task worthwhile. Linen was durable enough to withstand repeated washing, which made it one of the most valuable materials for everyday clothing. Its role in hygiene became even more important after communal bathhouses declined. When full immersion baths became rarer, maintaining clean linen garments provided one of the most reliable ways to stay comfortable. Comparing this system to modern hygiene reveals how different daily life once was. Today, people often rely on showers, scented soaps, and deodorants to manage sweat and odour. Clothing is washed in machines that require little effort. In the medieval world, however, fabric itself carried much of the responsibility for cleanliness. The linen layer quietly performed the task that modern plumbing and detergents now handle. There is something unexpectedly practical in this arrangement. While the medieval world lacked modern sanitation, it still developed methods that addressed basic needs using available materials. Linen clothing became a simple but effective technology of personal care. By absorbing sweat and allowing regular washing, it created a balance between limited bathing opportunities and the desire to remain socially acceptable. For people walking through markets, attending church, or meeting neighbours, appearance still mattered. Clean linen signalled that someone took care of themselves even in a challenging environment. A person whose undergarments were visibly dirty might be judged as careless or poor. In this way, linen served not only as protection against sweat, but also as a quiet marker of dignity. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval hygiene was not entirely neglectful, as stereotypes sometimes suggest. Instead, it relied on strategies adapted to the realities of the time. Linen clothing provided one of the most important of those strategies. It allowed people to maintain a degree of cleanliness, even when water, fuel, and bathing facilities were scarce. The layer of cloth hidden beneath heavy garments carries more responsibility than it first appears. It protected expensive clothing, absorbed sweat, and offered comfort in environments where bathing was rare. Through this quiet role, linen helped medieval people navigate daily life in a world where hygiene required patience and practical thinking. The linen layer worn beneath medieval clothing quietly absorbed sweat and dirt, acting as a simple but effective barrier between the body and expensive outer garments. Yet clothing alone could not solve every challenge of cleanliness in medieval life. The places where people relieved themselves were often crude structures built directly into castle walls, and the reality of those toilets would shock most modern visitors the moment they saw them. To understand medieval hygiene fully, it is necessary to look at a part of daily life that people rarely spoke about openly, but experienced every single day. In castles, towns, and even simple homes, the question of where human waste went was solved in ways that would feel startling to modern visitors. The medieval toilet was not a separate room with porcelain fixtures and running water. Instead, it was often a small stone space built directly into the wall of a fortress or tower, designed with one simple purpose. This structure was known as the garderobe. At first glance, the garderobe might appear surprisingly small. It was usually a narrow chamber built into the thick outer walls of a castle. Inside there might be a wooden seat, or simply a stone slab with a circular hole cut through the centre. Beneath that hole was an open, vertical shaft. When someone used the toilet, waste fell directly down this shaft and out through the outer wall of the building. Gravity handled the rest of the process. The destination of that waste varied depending on the design of the castle. In many fortresses, the shaft opened above a moat, allowing the contents to drop straight into the water below. In other cases, it fell onto the ground outside the castle walls, often collecting in pits or open areas that needed occasional clearing. The system required almost no plumbing, no pipes, and no complicated engineering. It relied entirely on the simple fact that what goes down must eventually land somewhere below. From a practical standpoint, the design had advantages. It removed waste from the living areas of the castle quickly and required little maintenance compared to more complex systems. Medieval builders valued solutions that were durable and simple. Thick stone walls could easily hide narrow shafts, and the structure could last for generations without needing major repairs. For the people who lived inside these castles, the garderobe was simply part of the architecture. Yet the experience of using such a toilet was very different from what modern people expect. The small chamber often had only a narrow slit window for ventilation. Cold air drifted through the opening, and the smell from the shaft below could rise upward depending on the wind. During warmer months, the odour could become particularly strong. Even in large castles where multiple garderobes existed, the area around them was rarely pleasant. Servants and castle workers understood this reality well. They often avoided lingering near these spaces longer than necessary. In some castles, guards or attendants were assigned the unpleasant task of clearing waste that collected outside the walls, or in pits beneath the shafts. This work was dirty, exhausting, and considered one of the least desirable responsibilities in the entire household. Despite these conditions, the garderobe represented a surprisingly thoughtful solution for its time. Many castles placed these toilets along outer walls so that waste would be carried away from the main living quarters. Some designs positioned them above flowing water or streams whenever possible. Others extended the shafts far enough downward that smells and insects were less likely to travel upward into the building. In towns and smaller buildings, the situation could be even less comfortable. Not every structure had the thick stone walls needed to support a built-in garderobe. In those places, people often relied on simple latrines placed behind buildings or over small pits dug into the ground. These pits collected waste over time until they were eventually emptied or covered. The process of cleaning them was unpleasant and rarely discussed openly, but it was necessary for the functioning of the community. Comparing this system with modern sanitation highlights how dramatically technology has changed everyday life. Today, toilets connect to pipes that carry waste far away from homes through underground sewer networks. Water flushes the bowl instantly, removing both waste and odour within seconds. In the medieval world, none of these conveniences existed. Waste disposal depended on gravity, open air, and the occasional labour of workers who had to deal with the results. The sensory experience of medieval castles must have been very different from what modern visitors imagine when they admire the impressive stone walls and towering battlements. Behind the grand halls and decorated chambers were these small, narrow toilet rooms built directly into the structure. The practical needs of life existed alongside the symbols of power and wealth. One detail often surprises modern observers when they learn about garderobes. Some historians believe that the name itself may come from the French words meaning to guard clothing. In certain castles, people occasionally hung garments in these small rooms because the constant airflow through the shaft helped keep moths away. While this may sound unusual today, it shows how people adapted to the conditions surrounding them in practical ways. Even with these adaptations, the overall environment around medieval toilets remained far from comfortable. The smell, the open shafts, and the constant awareness of waste falling beneath the castle walls created a reality that few modern people would willingly accept. Yet for centuries, this was simply how sanitation worked inside some of the most powerful buildings in Europe. Medieval society was accustomed to living closer to the realities of waste, dirt, and smell than modern societies are today. Without modern plumbing or sanitation systems, communities relied on methods that balanced practicality with available technology. The garderobe represented one such solution, simple and effective, but far removed from the expectations of the modern world. Over time, these systems became so normal that people barely thought about them. Nobles, servants, guards, and visitors all used them as part of their daily routine. The design was not hidden or secret, it was simply part of the castle's structure, built into the walls just like staircases and windows. Medieval castles solved the problem of human waste with simple structures built directly into their thick stone walls. Yet these private castle toilets were only one part of the sanitation story in the Middle Ages. In crowded towns where many families shared the same space, the experience of using a toilet could become even more uncomfortable and far more chaotic. Life inside medieval towns was crowded in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Narrow streets twisted between rows of timber houses, upper floors leaned outward over the roads, and families lived close together, in buildings that often held far more people than they were originally designed for. In such environments, the question of sanitation was not solved by private facilities. Most homes simply did not have the space or structure to support their own latrines. Instead, the solution was shared. Entire groups of households relied on a single communal toilet located somewhere nearby. These shared latrines were usually placed at the edge of a courtyard or at the far end of an alley. In many neighbourhoods, they stood behind the houses, tucked away where they would cause the least disruption to daily life. Sometimes they were small wooden huts, built above pits dug into the ground. Other times they were simple stone structures connected to shallow channels that carried waste away from the buildings. Their appearance varied widely from town to town, depending on local customs and the materials available. For the families who lived around them, these communal toilets became a regular part of their daily routine. People walked to them several times a day, often carrying small containers of water or cloths for cleaning. Children learned early where these structures stood and how to use them properly. Because so many people depended on the same facility, timing mattered. Early morning and evening were often the busiest hours, when neighbours might quietly queue outside waiting for their turn. Unlike the private garderobes found in castles, these shared toilets required cooperation among the residents who used them. Their cleanliness depended entirely on the habits of the community. If the neighbours worked together to maintain them, the structures could remain reasonably usable. Waste pits might be cleared periodically, and wooden seats or walls might be repaired when they begin to decay. In neighbourhoods where people were careful, the latrine could function as a simple but effective system. However, such cooperation was not always guaranteed. Medieval towns were busy places filled with traders, labourers, apprentices, and travellers passing through. Not everyone felt responsible for maintaining shared spaces. When a latrine was neglected, the results quickly became unpleasant. Waste could accumulate faster than it was removed, wooden structures could rot, and the surrounding ground could become damp and foul-smelling. In narrow courtyards where airflow was limited, odours could linger heavily in the air. The challenge of maintaining these shared toilets became especially difficult in densely populated districts. As towns grew larger during the later Middle Ages, more families crowded into the same spaces. Houses were divided into smaller rooms to accommodate tenants, and entire families might live within a single floor of a building. Yet the number of sanitation facilities rarely increased at the same pace as the population. One communal latrine might serve dozens of people, all relying on the same simple structure. Under such conditions, hygiene varied greatly from place to place. In some neighbourhoods, residents organised regular cleaning efforts. Waste pits were emptied by workers who carried the material away to dumping grounds outside the city walls. These unpleasant but necessary jobs were performed by labourers whose work rarely appeared in official records, but was essential to keeping towns livable. Without their efforts, the accumulation of waste would have quickly overwhelmed urban spaces. In other neighbourhoods, however, the situation could deteriorate rapidly. If pits were not emptied in time, or if structures were poorly maintained, the area around the latrine could become one of the least pleasant parts of the town. Mud, waste, and stagnant water might mix after rainfall. Flies and insects gathered easily in such conditions, particularly during warm months. Residents who lived nearby often had little choice but to tolerate the smells drifting through their windows. Modern readers often find these descriptions disturbing, but it is important to remember that medieval people were accustomed to living much closer to the realities of waste than modern societies are. Without underground sewer systems or running water, every community had to find its own practical solution. Shared latrines represented one of the simplest ways to manage sanitation in crowded environments. At the same time, people did not completely ignore the problem. Town authorities sometimes issued rules about where latrines could be built and how waste should be removed. Certain areas were designated for dumping waste outside the city walls. In some places, fines were imposed on residents who allowed refuse or waste to accumulate dangerously. Enforcement was not always consistent, but these efforts show that medieval communities understood the importance of managing sanitation as best they could. The experience of using a communal toilet must have been very different from the privacy modern people expect today. The structures were small, often dimly lit, and rarely designed with comfort in mind. Yet they served a necessary purpose for thousands of people who lived within the crowded streets of medieval towns. Without them, daily life in these communities would have been even more difficult. Looking back, the system reveals how medieval society balanced practicality with limited technology. Shared facilities allowed entire neighbourhoods to function despite the absence of plumbing. They were imperfect solutions, shaped by the materials, knowledge, and resources available at the time. For the people who used them every day, they were simply part of ordinary urban life. Even so, communal toilets were only one part of the broader challenge of hygiene. After using these facilities, people still faced the question of how to clean themselves. In a world without modern toilet paper, individuals relied on a surprising variety of materials to solve that final problem of sanitation. Shared latrines allowed crowded medieval neighbourhoods to function despite the absence of private toilets. Yet the challenge of sanitation did not end once people left those structures. The real surprise for modern readers comes when we discover what people actually used instead of toilet paper. One of the most ordinary objects in modern bathrooms would have been completely unfamiliar to people living in the Middle Ages. The soft roll of toilet paper that sits beside the toilet today did not exist in medieval Europe. In fact, the very idea of a standardized disposable product used for personal cleaning was still centuries away. Yet people still had to solve the same problem that every human being faces. After using a latrine or communal toilet, they needed some way to clean themselves. The solutions were simple, practical, and shaped by whatever materials were easy to find nearby. Instead of a manufactured product, medieval people relied on objects that were already part of everyday life. These items varied depending on region, social class, and environment, but the principle was always the same. People used what was available, what was cheap, and what could be replaced easily. One of the most common materials was dry straw. In rural communities where farming dominated daily life, straw was everywhere. It filled mattresses, lined animal stalls, and remained scattered across barns and courtyards after harvest seasons. Its rough texture made it suitable for wiping, and it could be discarded immediately afterward. For farmers and villagers, grabbing a handful of straw from a nearby pile was often the easiest solution. Leaves also served a similar purpose, especially during warmer months. Trees and plants provided an endless supply of soft foliage that could be collected quickly. In forested areas, people sometimes preferred broad leaves that offered better coverage and comfort. The practice required little preparation. A person could simply step outside, gather a few leaves, and use them before returning to daily tasks. Nature itself provided the material needed for this most private routine. Another method involved the use of cloth. Old pieces of fabric that were too worn for clothing were sometimes repurposed for cleaning. These scraps could be washed and reused repeatedly. In households where linen or other fabrics were already part of daily life, keeping a few cloths nearby for sanitation purposes was practical. After use, the cloth could be rinsed in water and cleaned along with other household textiles. Water itself sometimes replaced wiping altogether. In certain situations, people simply washed the area with water instead of using dry materials. This method required access to a bucket, basin, or nearby stream, but it was effective and familiar in many cultures. Carrying a small container of water to a latrine was not uncommon, particularly in towns where communal facilities were used by many residents throughout the day. From a modern perspective, these methods might appear uncomfortable or primitive, yet they reflected a straightforward approach to daily hygiene. Medieval people did not view these practices as unusual. They were simply the logical solutions available within the limits of their environment. Manufactured paper products had not yet become widespread, and even if they had existed, the cost would likely have placed them far beyond the reach of most families. The absence of toilet paper reminds us how different the material culture of the medieval world was from our own. Today, entire industries produce specialized products designed for convenience and comfort. Packaging, softness, and scent are carefully engineered. In contrast, medieval societies relied almost entirely on natural materials and reusable household items. The goal was not luxury, but practicality. These practices also highlight how closely medieval life remained connected to the surrounding landscape. Fields, forests, and gardens supplied many of the materials needed for daily routines. A pile of straw, a handful of leaves, or a piece of cloth could all serve the same purpose, without requiring factories or trade networks. In this sense, sanitation depended as much on the natural environment as it did on human ingenuity. It is important to note that these methods were not always perfectly hygienic by modern standards. Rough materials could irritate the skin, and reused cloth required careful washing to remain clean. Yet medieval people adapted their habits in ways that balanced comfort with practicality. Over time, these routines became normal parts of daily life, passed down from one generation to the next. Even within the same town, practices could vary widely. Wealthier households might keep small cloths specifically for personal cleaning, while poorer families relied almost entirely on whatever materials they could gather outdoors. Travelers often had to improvise using whatever resources were available along the road. The diversity of these methods reflected the flexible nature of medieval hygiene. Modern readers often imagine medieval sanitation as entirely chaotic, but the reality was more nuanced. People understood the importance of cleaning themselves after using the toilet. They simply achieved this goal through materials that were familiar and readily available, rather than manufactured products. The absence of toilet paper did not mean the absence of hygiene. It meant that hygiene followed a different set of tools. Thinking about this difference can be surprisingly revealing. It shows how something as ordinary as a bathroom routine is shaped by technology, trade, and cultural expectations. The modern bathroom represents centuries of development in manufacturing, plumbing, and public health. Medieval people lived at an earlier stage of that history, relying on natural materials and simple solutions. Even so, sanitation involved more than personal habits alone. The larger environment surrounding towns and villages played a powerful role in shaping daily life. Clean water was not always easy to find, and the condition of local wells, rivers, and streams could influence everything from cooking to hygiene. Medieval people used straw, leaves, cloth, or water to solve the simple problem of cleaning themselves in a world without toilet paper. Yet personal habits alone could not guarantee cleanliness in everyday life. A deeper problem appeared when the water people relied on for drinking and washing was sometimes polluted by the very waste they were trying to escape. Clean water, something most people today can obtain by turning a simple handle, was never guaranteed in the towns and villages of the Middle Ages. Every drop had to be found, carried, and protected carefully. Without pipes, pumps, or filtration systems, medieval communities depended entirely on natural sources. Wells dug into the ground, streams flowing through valleys, and rivers running beside city walls provided the water that people needed for drinking, cooking, and washing. Yet these same sources often carried dangers that were not immediately visible. In many medieval towns, the well stood at the centre of daily life. It might be located in a courtyard, a market square, or along a busy street where residents gathered each morning. People arrived carrying wooden buckets, clay jugs, or metal pails. Drawing water required physical effort. A rope had to be lowered, a bucket filled, and the weight lifted carefully back to the surface. For households that needed several containers each day, the process repeated again and again. These wells were essential, yet they were also vulnerable. Unlike modern wells protected by sealed systems, medieval ones were often exposed to whatever entered the surrounding ground. Rainwater washed soil and debris toward them. Waste pits located nearby sometimes leaked into the earth. When animals wandered too close, their droppings could contaminate the area around the well. Even a small amount of pollution could affect the water drawn from below. Rivers and streams offered another important supply, particularly for larger towns built near flowing water. These waterways provided large quantities of water that could be collected quickly. People filled buckets along the riverbanks or carried water back from nearby bridges. At first glance, moving water seemed cleaner than standing water, yet rivers were rarely used only for drinking. They also served as places where laundry was washed, animals drank, and waste from houses or workshops was sometimes discarded. This mixture of uses created a complicated situation. A river that looked clear might still carry unseen impurities from upstream settlements. When towns grew larger and industries expanded, the problem became even more noticeable. Tanneries, dye workshops, and slaughterhouses occasionally released waste into the same water that residents relied upon for daily needs. Without an understanding of microscopic organisms or chemical pollution, people could not always recognize the risks hidden within these waters. The consequences sometimes appeared gradually. Individuals might become sick after drinking contaminated water, yet the cause was rarely obvious. Illness could spread quietly through households and neighborhoods before anyone realized the connection. Medieval people did not understand bacteria or viruses, so they explained disease through other ideas. Many believed that harmful vapors or foul smells carried sickness rather than invisible organisms in water. Despite these uncertainties, communities still depended on the same sources every day. Water remained necessary for cooking meals, brewing drinks, and washing clothing. Even when people suspected that a river or well was not perfectly clean, they often had few alternatives. Carrying water from distant springs required long journeys, and not every settlement had access to such sources. The difficulty of obtaining clean water affected personal hygiene in subtle but important ways. Bathing already required large quantities of heated water, which meant people were cautious about using it unnecessarily. When the quality of available water was uncertain, the incentive to conserve it grew even stronger. Households preferred to reserve water for drinking and cooking rather than for full baths. As a result, the routines described in earlier parts of this story became even more important. Washing small parts of the body, cleaning linen garments, and using cloths to wipe the skin allowed people to maintain some level of hygiene without consuming too much water. These habits were not merely traditions, they were practical adaptations to the realities of living in environments where water could not be wasted. Some towns attempted to improve their water systems through basic engineering. Wooden pipes or channels occasionally directed water from distant springs toward public fountains. In a few places, these systems reduced the effort required to collect water. However, such improvements remained limited and often fragile. Pipes could break, channels could become blocked, and maintenance required constant attention. For most residents, daily life continued to revolve around wells and rivers. Early mornings might begin with the sound of buckets scraping against stone as neighbours gathered to draw water. Children carried smaller containers home, while adults balanced heavy loads across their shoulders. These routines were repeated every day, shaping the rhythm of medieval communities. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to underestimate how central water was to survival. Today, clean water appears instantly in kitchens and bathrooms, treated and transported through complex infrastructure. In the Middle Ages, obtaining it required cooperation, effort, and sometimes luck. A polluted well or a contaminated river could disrupt the life of an entire neighbourhood. The scarcity and uncertainty of clean water remind us that medieval hygiene was shaped by environmental limits as much as by cultural habits. People did not ignore cleanliness. Instead, they navigated the challenges presented by the resources available to them. Their methods may appear imperfect today, but they represented practical solutions within a very different technological landscape. Understanding this challenge helps explain why certain smells and conditions became familiar parts of medieval urban life. When water supplies were uncertain and sanitation systems were simple, towns developed distinctive environments that modern visitors might find overwhelming. Access to water determined how people cooked, washed, and tried to stay clean in medieval towns. Yet the difficulty of finding truly clean water was only one reason medieval cities had such powerful smells. Streets filled with animals, markets, and waste created an atmosphere that modern visitors would find almost unbearable. Walking into a medieval city would have been an experience unlike anything most modern visitors could imagine. Long before one saw the towers, market stalls, or crowded houses, the first thing that announced the presence of the town was often its smell. The air itself carried a mixture of scents that drifted through narrow streets and between tightly packed buildings. For people living in the Middle Ages, this mixture was simply part of daily life. For a traveller arriving from the countryside, it could be overwhelming. Medieval streets were rarely clean in the modern sense of the word. Most roads were made from packed earth or uneven stone, and they collected everything that passed over them. Horses, carts, and livestock moved through the streets from early morning until nightfall. Each animal left behind waste that mixed with mud and rainwater. Over time, the ground became a thick blend of soil, manure, and debris that clung to boots and wagon wheels. The rain only made the situation more complicated. Instead of washing the streets clean, heavy showers often turned the ground into a thick, slippery surface. Mud absorbed whatever waste lay on the road, trapping smells that lingered long after the rain stopped. When the weather warmed again, the sun released those odours back into the air. The result was a scent that seemed to hover permanently over many busy neighbourhoods. Markets added their own powerful contribution to the atmosphere. Medieval markets were lively places filled with traders selling vegetables, grain, fish, and meat. Farmers arrived with carts of produce from nearby villages, while fishermen carried baskets filled with the day's catch. But not everything sold in the market disappeared immediately. Leftover scraps of food sometimes fell to the ground and remained there until someone swept them away. Fish stalls in particular were known for their strong scent. Fresh fish already carried a noticeable smell, and as the day progressed, the odour grew heavier in the warmth of the afternoon sun. Nearby meat vendors displayed cuts of pork, beef, and mutton on wooden tables. Blood and fat occasionally dripped onto the ground beneath the stalls. Even when sellers tried to keep their areas clean, traces of these materials often remained. Slaughterhouses produced another layer of smell within the city. Animals brought into town for processing were killed and prepared in specialized areas where butchers worked throughout the day. The process created waste that had to be removed or discarded somewhere nearby. Although some cities attempted to regulate where slaughterhouses could operate, the scent of these places still drifted through surrounding streets. Outdoor cooking added yet another element to the mixture. Many medieval households prepared meals over open fires or small kitchen hearths that vented smoke directly into the air. Vendors in busy markets sometimes cooked food outside, roasting meat or baking bread, where customers could see the process. The aroma of cooking could be pleasant on its own, but when combined with the other smells of the city, it became part of a much more complex atmosphere. Garbage also played a role in shaping the scent of medieval towns. Without organised waste collection systems, households often disposed of scraps and refuse in nearby areas or simple pits. Some towns created dumping grounds outside their walls, but smaller amounts of waste still accumulated within neighbourhoods. Bits of food, broken objects, and animal remains could remain in the corners of streets until someone removed them. All of these elements blended in the confined spaces of medieval urban design. Houses were built close together, and upper floors sometimes extended outward over the street below. This architecture created narrow passages where air circulated slowly. Instead of quickly dispersing unpleasant smells, the tight layout allowed them to linger. For people who lived in these towns every day, however, the experience was very different from what a modern visitor might feel. Human senses adapt quickly to familiar environments. Residents who grew up surrounded by these smells often noticed them far less than outsiders did. The scent of the market, the animals, and the streets became part of the background of daily life. Travellers occasionally wrote about the contrast when they entered large cities after spending time in rural areas. The sudden concentration of people, animals, and activity created an atmosphere that seemed intense at first. Yet even these visitors usually adjusted after a short time. Once the smells became familiar, they faded into the ordinary rhythm of city life. The presence of these odours also reminds us that medieval cities were vibrant, active places, rather than quiet museum pieces. Every smell represented some part of the economy or daily routine. Animals transported goods, markets supplied food, and workshops produced materials needed for trade. The mixture of scents was the byproduct of a society working, trading, and surviving within its physical limits. Modern sanitation systems and waste management have dramatically changed how cities smell today. Sewers carry waste away through underground pipes, garbage is collected regularly, and strict regulations control food preparation. In the Middle Ages, none of these systems existed. Urban life operated through simpler methods that inevitably left their mark on the environment. Understanding the smell of medieval cities helps paint a more realistic picture of everyday life in that era. Behind the castles, cathedrals, and grand halls, often highlighted in history books, was a living city full of ordinary human activity. The scents drifting through its streets were as much a part of the landscape as the buildings themselves. Yet medieval people did not simply accept unpleasant odours without response. Over time, they developed their own ways of coping with the environment around them. One of the most common solutions involved carrying pleasant scents that could mask the smells of crowded streets and busy markets. Medieval cities were filled with the smells of animals, markets, cooking fires, and crowded streets. Yet people living in these environments did not simply endure the odours without trying to improve their surroundings. Many began carrying small bundles of fragrant plants and herbs to protect themselves from the overwhelming scents of daily life. In a world where the air of cities often carried the smell of animals, smoke, and crowded streets, medieval people developed their own quiet strategies to remain comfortable in public spaces. Without modern perfumes, deodorants, or scented soaps, one of the simplest solutions was found in nature itself. Plants with strong and pleasant aromas became valuable tools in daily life. Many individuals carried small bundles of herbs or dried flowers with them, using these natural scents to soften the harsher smells that surrounded them. These fragrant bundles were often called herb sachets or small scent bags. They were simple objects, sometimes nothing more than a small cloth pouch tied with a cord. Inside the pouch were dried leaves, petals, or aromatic stems gathered from gardens and nearby fields. When carried in a pocket, hung from a belt, or tucked inside clothing, the herbs slowly released their scent throughout the day. Among the most popular plants used for this purpose were rosemary and lavender. Both were widely known in medieval Europe for their strong and pleasant fragrance. Rosemary grew easily in many regions and was valued not only for its scent, but also for its association with freshness and cleanliness. Lavender, with its gentle floral aroma, was equally admired and often dried carefully so that its scent would last for months. People believed these herbs did more than simply smell pleasant. Many thought that strong natural fragrances could protect them from harmful vapors in the air. Medieval medicine often described disease as something carried by foul smells or corrupted air. According to this belief, breathing pleasant scents could help guard the body from illness. Carrying fragrant herbs, therefore, served both a practical and symbolic purpose. The practice of using herbs to improve personal scent was not limited to the wealthy. While nobles might have access to imported perfumes or expensive oils, ordinary people relied on plants they could gather or grow themselves. Rosemary bushes and lavender patches were common in many gardens, and wild herbs could be collected along roadsides or fields. Preparing a sachet required little effort, making it accessible to nearly everyone. In crowded towns, these small bundles of fragrance became particularly useful. Walking through busy markets or narrow streets meant encountering a mixture of smells from animals, cooking fires, and waste. Holding a scented herb pouch near the nose could make such environments more tolerable. Even a faint scent of lavender or rosemary could soften the stronger odours drifting through the air. Herbs were also placed inside clothing and bedding. Dried plants were sometimes scattered among stored garments to keep fabrics smelling fresh. Linen chests might contain small bundles of herbs tucked between folded clothing. This practice helped maintain a sense of cleanliness, even when washing opportunities were limited. Bedrooms often benefited from these natural fragrances as well. Medieval mattresses were frequently filled with straw or other plant materials that could trap odours over time. By adding aromatic herbs to bedding, households created a more pleasant environment for sleep. The scent released slowly during the night, giving the room a feeling of freshness. These habits reveal an interesting balance within medieval hygiene practices. People understood that strong odours could be unpleasant or even unhealthy, yet they lacked the chemical products that modern societies rely upon. Instead, they turned to the resources provided by their surroundings. Plants offered a natural way to improve the atmosphere of homes, clothing, and crowded streets. The use of herbs also connected medieval hygiene with the rhythms of the seasons. Fresh plants were gathered in spring and summer, then dried carefully for use during colder months. Bundles hung from beams or rafters where air could circulate them. Over time, these drying herbs filled homes with subtle fragrance even before they were used. From a modern perspective, this reliance on plants might seem modest compared with the powerful fragrances found in contemporary perfumes and cleaning products. Yet the medieval approach carried its own quiet practicality. The scents were gentle rather than overwhelming, and they blended naturally with the environment rather than trying to overpower it. Travellers moving through towns might notice these herbal aromas drifting faintly from doorways or clothing. The scent of rosemary or lavender could mingle with the smell of bread baking or wood smoke rising from hearths. These subtle fragrances helped soften the harsher aspects of urban life and gave medieval communities their own distinctive atmosphere. In many ways, these practices demonstrate how medieval people adapted creatively to the challenges of their environment. Without access to modern hygiene products, they developed methods that used simple natural materials. Herbs offered an affordable way to maintain comfort and dignity, even when surrounding conditions were less than ideal. The habit of carrying fragrant plants persisted for centuries and influenced later traditions of perfumery and scented goods. Over time, herbal oils and distilled fragrances became more refined, eventually leading to the perfumes and deodorants familiar today. Yet the roots of these products can be traced back to those simple sachets of dried herbs carried quietly through medieval streets. Even with these fragrant solutions, however, medieval people still faced other challenges in maintaining personal cleanliness. Pleasant scents could mask odours temporarily, but they could not remove every problem associated with daily hygiene. Another important part of personal care involved the maintenance of hair and facial hair, which required its own set of skills and services. Fragrant herbs allowed medieval people to soften the odours of crowded streets and busy homes, yet pleasant scents alone could not solve every challenge of personal appearance. The responsibility for keeping hair and beards neat often fell to a surprising place that served as both a grooming shop and a small medical clinic. Personal appearance in the Middle Ages was influenced by more than clothing and cleanliness. Hair and beards also played an important role in how individuals were perceived within their communities. In towns and cities, men who wished to maintain a respectable appearance often relied on the services of barbers. These establishments were far more than simple haircutting shops. They were places where grooming, healthcare, and social interaction came together in ways that might surprise modern observers. Barber shops were commonly found along busy streets or near market areas where foot traffic was constant. The interior of such a place was usually modest. A wooden chair, a table for tools, and perhaps a basin for washing were often enough to conduct the work of the day. Barbers kept simple instruments such as razors, scissors, and combs ready for their customers. These tools might be sharpened each morning carefully before the first visitor arrives. Men visited barbers for a variety of grooming tasks. Cutting hair was one of the most common services. Medieval hairstyles were often practical rather than decorative, and keeping hair trimmed helped maintain a neat appearance. A shorter style also made it easier to manage hair beneath hats or helmets, which were worn frequently by soldiers, travellers, and workers. Shaving beards was another important task. Facial hairstyles varied depending on region and social customs, but many men preferred to keep their beards trimmed or removed entirely. Shaving with a straight razor required skill and a steady hand. Attempting the task alone could easily result in cuts or irritation. For that reason, visiting a barber was often the safer and more comfortable choice. The barber's role, however, extended well beyond simple grooming. In medieval society, barbers frequently served as providers of basic medical services. This dual profession developed partly because the tools used for shaving resembled those needed for minor medical procedures. Over time, barbers became known as individuals capable of performing tasks such as treating wounds, extracting teeth, and performing a procedure known as bloodletting. Bloodletting was based on the medical belief that illness resulted from an imbalance of bodily fluids. By removing a small quantity of blood, practitioners believed they could restore balance within the body. Barbers used special knives or lancets to carry out this procedure, often in the same chair where haircuts were given. While modern medicine no longer follows these practices, they were widely accepted during the medieval period. Because of these combined roles, the barber shop became an important gathering place within the community. Men visited not only to cut their hair or shave, but also to seek advice or treatment for minor ailments. Conversations often filled the room while customers waited for their turn. News from nearby villages, travelling merchants, or distant regions might circulate through these casual discussions.